centers. So there's been sort of major issues recently. So this situation of people sort of fleeing from Central America is part of a long sort of history of violence in the period, particularly sort of the Guatemalan Civil War from 1926, but at its height in the 1980s, there were over 200,000 Maya who were killed or disappeared. So what I'd like to do is talk about the history of violence in Guatemala for a bit, and give you some background on the history of violence and the current violence that's happening that people are fleeing, and then talk about the problems that they face with language access and communication sort of across cultures. So just a quick overview. The indigenous languages are sort of spoken throughout Latin America. Mexico, this chart says 67, but originally there were over 200. And Guatemala is a very small country, but has 24 indigenous languages. So it's a very complex multilingual situation. This is a map of the indigenous languages spoken in Mexico. And these that are listed with a star are almost all Guatemalan languages that are primarily spoken along the border of people who sought refuge in Mexico from Guatemala. You'll also notice that there's a lot of sort of variation of languages down in the southern part of Mexico. And there's also ethnic violence there that has led to increased immigration. This is Oaxaca, one of the states in southern Mexico, just to give you a sense of how complex the linguistic situation is. Each of these languages is a different language, and most of them are from different families. So, and in fact, they actually are names of groups of languages rather than single languages. So Chachino, for example, is 6 different languages. There's a mismatch between sort of the speakers of indigenous languages in Mexico and Guatemala and the people who come to the US. So if you sort of look at a pie chart, it's the most widely spoken language is Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs. And then Maya, which is Yucatec Maya, which is spoken mainly in the Yucatan Peninsula. But in the US, speakers tend to come from different communities. So this is a chart of languages in California versus language in Mexico. And you can see that Mixtec and Zapotec, which are not the most widely spoken indigenous languages, are the ones that are most widely spoken in the US. So people from specific communities are coming that may not represent the actual sort of makeup of the places where they come from. I work with Mayan languages, so this is a map of Mayan languages. The larger the writing, the more speakers the language has. I work primarily with Quiche, which is the language with the most speakers in Guatemala. So this is a map of Guatemala with the different languages, just to let you see. This part through here is Spanish speaking, but most of the mountainous and forest regions of Guatemala are inhabited by indigenous speakers. And I just want to sort of remember the number of indigenous people who have died in custody of the Border Patrol in the last 2 years. There have been a number of people who have died at the border. So this is Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez. She was Mom Maya. This is Jacqueline Amy Rosemary Cal Marroquin. She was Chi Maya. Felipe Gomez Alonso was Chuj. These are all different Mayan ethnic groups. Juan Leon Gutierrez was Chortí. And Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez was there's similar problems. So clearly a main portion of people who have sort of died in the child custody centers have been indigenous children. And there have been problems with indigenous sort of people in the US as well. Quite a number of years ago, Cyril Baltazar Cruz, who was Chatino, was had her child taken away because the Spanish interpreter got this sort of bizarre story that seems that it was mostly in her imagination, that Cirila was working as a prostitute in exchange for drugs and was hoping to sell the baby. And her child was taken away. The judge actually gave the child to friends of his who were having trouble adopting. And she got her child back when the baby was 3 years old, and she sued the state of Mississippi for a lot of money. Another sort of really infamous case is that of Santiago Ventura Morales, who was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison in Oregon in the late 1980s. He was given a Spanish interpreter, but he was monolingual in Mixtec. So there are places where entire villages from Mexico sort of come or send a huge portion of their people together, and so they still maintain their indigenous languages in the U.S. So just an example from his trial, right? So the judge asked the interpreter to interpret something he says, and he says, no, that was Mestiquen, which isn't the name of the language. And it goes back and forth, and it turns out that the Santiago can't really express anything because the interpreter doesn't understand anything he's saying, and he doesn't really understand Spanish very well. And this is a really common problem. I've worked with 3 cases in Kentucky of immigrants who were in prison because of interviews with police that were conducted in Spanish, where it was clear they didn't fully understand what was happening. So when people think of the Maya, they tend to think of sort of the ancient Maya, the end of the world kind of 2020 thing, which was all a myth. Maya, they're different. And there's about Guatemala, Honduras, and Belize, and Southern.
Hey, Rusty?
Yeah?
You are, there we go. You were breaking up there for a while, but it's better now. Thanks.
Okay. Just let me know. So this is just a map of down here. It's related to aspects. So just background on the and why people are sort of fleeing Guatemala. So slavery was basically instated in Guatemala in the 1870s. And every Maya village was forced to give a certain number of men up to work on the coffee and sugar plantations. So this continued for almost 100 years. In 1950, Arbenz was elected sort of as president, progressive reformer, and he actually sort of ended slavery in Guatemala, which is sort of shocking that slavery didn't end until 1950. And the slaves were actually working for American fruit and coffee companies. So when Arbenz basically took all these sort of free employment away from American corporations, our government didn't take it too well, and we initiated a coup that threw Arbenz out and put in a dictator that we had chosen. That's what led to the Civil War. So the sort of leftists who had supported Arbenz began the war sort of trying to overthrow the government that the US had put in place. In the 1980s, during sort of the height of fear of communism, there was a sort of huge rise in violence in Guatemala because the government represented it as fighting communism rather than sort of actually ethnic cleansing, which is what it was. The U.S. actually supported it and provided most of the arms and lots of the training for the military that attacked the Maya. So this is a site of massacre, so there were some horrific things that happened. And this is where the Maya regions are, you can see that the vast majority of the massacres during the Civil War occurred where indigenous communities are, particularly the Ixil, Acateco, and northern Quiché and Cataguales. So in the 1980s, we saw the worst sort of violence in Guatemala. There were entire villages destroyed. Violence just became normalized. People lived in the mountains. They tried to hold school in the rainforest and so on. But for many, many years, communities were totally sort of thrown out of whack. These are just some examples. The picture on the top is Guatemalan armies shooting Mayan villagers from a helicopter. The helicopter was provided by us. And on the bottom, checking proof for military service on a bus. When I first went to Guatemala, this was still very common. And you would be stopped, and I would always be held at gunpoint on one side of the bus while the Guatemalans were on the other side of the bus. And then some of them would always be taken away to be forced to join the army. So they burned and destroyed entire villages, and it was a horrific, horrific war. So that violence is still a major part of the historical memory in Guatemala. So starting in '96, there have been exhumations of the mass graves and attempts to sort of link the remains of victims with their families. And in 2005, there was a discovery of the archive of the Guatemalan National Police, which had the records of the death squads and actually the passports of all the people, most of the people that they had murdered. And then in 2013, Rios Montt, who had been the president during the height of the genocide, was put on trial for genocide. So the exhumations are sort of ongoing and a very constant thing. The bodies are sort of gone through by anthropologists, archaeologists, and sorted. So this is an elementary school where all of the children were killed. And each of these boxes is the remains and the clothing, whatever objects were found. So the remains are put in sort of little coffins that are sort of given back to the families, and they then have traditional sort of ceremonies to reinter the bodies in a rightful way so they have a decent burial. Okay. The archives of the police that were discovered have now been put online, but they're sort of were for the last 15 years been discussed in Guatemala. People sort of use the website now to find out what happened to their relatives and so on. It's and then the trial of Rios Montt was sort of the first time someone had been put on trial for genocide in their own country. And he was found guilty, but the result was overturned by the Guatemalan Supreme Court, and then they decided he was too senile for a retrial. Other sorts of things region in terms of why people flee. One is the adoption industry. So from the sort of late years of the war up until 2007, it was really common. There was sort of a major flow of children from Guatemala. The sort of fee you would get paid for bringing in a child to put up for adoption was more than most people made in a year in Guatemala. So a number of children were stolen, kidnapped, taken from their families, and basically sold to American parents. The Guatemalan government finally stopped this in 2007. So this sort of history of violence has made violence sort of normative in a lot of Guatemala. So there's actually sort of a movement now in Guatemala of Maya Lives Matter that is sort of draws on and sort of a lot about American parents, African Americans in the U.S. in terms of having suffered major violence and trauma. So some drawings from children in Villanueva, which is a suburb of Guatemala City, and they were asked, how does violence affect you? You can see some of them have domestic violence, but a number of them have sort sort of serious sort of violent crime. Violence is rampant in Guatemala. Guatemala is #1 in the Americas in terms of the murder of women. And again, the sort of rape was very widespread during the war, and violence against women has just become sort of normativized. Then the communities are also victims of gang-related violence simply because they're sort of kind of easy targets because they've been sort of abused for so long. And there's lots of extortion against individuals and businesses. There's lots of young people are kidnapped. So some of the sort of teenagers who came to the US alone were people who were escaping being kidnapped. I worked with a kid here who was a teenager who was kidnapped by a gang who threatened to kill his whole family if he didn't help them with the drug trade. The police in Guatemala are never Maya, and they usually operate only through bribes. They don't really care about violence against the Maya. And so crime is usually sort of done by mob rule. This is a case where the policeman was publicly flogged for not releasing someone that the community wanted to lynch. So lynchings are fairly common. Often sort of children are brought to see the lynchings, and people film them and show them on social media. This is a school where the children on the playground, and they have to wait to go to school until the crime scene is looked at. When you have these cases of mob violence, it could be something small like someone stole something, and then they're probably going to be the crime will be less severe, like maybe if it's a woman, they'll shave her hair, and they have but for more severe crimes, you just get gang violence, sort of. And the most common result is being burned alive. An example just a couple of weeks ago, Domingo Choc, who was a Chimaya traditional healer, was burned alive after being beaten for hours and hours for being a witch doctor. He was actually sort of working with foreign universities to record the medicinal plants that the Maya use. So people thought he was somehow there's also a lot of environmental violence. So here you can see an example of Guatemala that has been destroyed. The global warming has led to a shorter rainy season. So in the last 15 years, growing enough corn to keep them through the year, where that used to be sort of an easy thing to do. 79% live in poverty, most of them in extreme poverty. It's a very the child mortality rate is very high. It's second only to Haiti in the Americas. The majority of indigenous children have malnutrition of some sort. To Spanish speakers, there's not education in Mayan languages, and there's all sorts of racist discourse against the Maya. So what I want to sort of focus on is how these people, when they get here, the issues of language and what they sort of the problems that arise. So the main issue seems to be language ideologies or beliefs about language that lead people to accept certain situations rather than there not actually being resources available to provide language services. In other words, it's not that we don't have the ability to provide these people with language services, It's that we believe things about language that lead us to accept that they just aren't going to get language access. So it's during that sort of the children of border trauma, there was a lot of press about the problems of sort of how can we find interpreters? How do you find an interpreter for an ancient language? And it turns out there actually are interpreters available. There are interpreters available. So there's 855 Maya USA. You can connect to speakers of different Mayan languages. There's a National Maya Interpreters Network, and there are a number of groups around the country working on sort of efforts to train even more interpreters. So the sorts of language ideologies or beliefs that you see related to the denial of access is this idea that, oh, well, those are such weird languages. How could you ever have interpreters, right? Who speaks those languages? Right? Or the idea that, well, if you live in Guatemala, you must speak Spanish, right? So we can just give them a Spanish interpreter. So there are lots of sort of things that make it easy to sort of ignore the fact that people aren't actually getting access to interpreters who can actually speak their languages. So there's also sort of this call for volunteer translators, both within communities and among to do translation. So the training of interpreters has come entirely from the communities themselves. So particularly in Southern California, Indigenous communities have sort of come to develop norms for training interpreters in their various languages. But there's sort of no effort on the part of the government to train people or sort of help them with issues of sort of legal language and things like that. So this is from Sonia Rell at UCLA. But basically the idea that we can just find volunteers to do it, we don't, they're not professionals out there when they really are. There's sort of a willful refusal to actually sort of train and use the professional translators that are here, which then makes it worse for them because they're not getting hired, so they haven't worked. So, so one problem is that we sort of don't give resources to people too often. Another is that people are sort of given interpreters who speak Spanish. So one question is sort of, well, does that work? So in cases where people know enough Spanish to actually communicate, you still have sort of major problems in interactions. So this is an example of a case that I worked on here. Who was interviewed by the Cabinet of Family Services in Spanish. And one question was, does the child experience domestic violence in their home country? And the Spanish interpreter's answer had been, there's no violence, family life is typical of the community. So I worked with the lawyer, we went through the questions that had been asked in Spanish and asked them again in Quiche to the Maya child. And the actual answer to the question was that the child was beaten 5 to 7 times a week, usually with a whip, a stick, or a board, and at least once a week they were severe enough wounds to bleed. Right? So you can get really totally different answers just by using the language that people actually speak. Right? So there are a few sort of issues I want to focus on before we stop for questions. One is sort of the communicative burden. So who's responsible for making sure that communication goes back and forth between individuals? Polysemy, which is things that mean more than one thing, which is really common in languages, but leads to lots of problems in, particularly in interactions in Spanish. And then sort of ways of interacting and stories in Indigenous communities and why they become problematic. So communication is obviously a two-way street, right? But it's common when someone does speak English or speaks a variety of English that is looked down upon, that people will sort of shut down and not do their part of the trying to make communication happen. And in so sorry, there. So one problem is this issue of polysemy, things that mean multiple things. So in Mayan languages, you have a lot of words that mean lots of different things depending on context, right? So the word kak can mean fire or heat or fire or gun or light bulb or electricity or fever, anything having to do with heat, right? Similarly, cheech could be anything having to do with metal. This is an example from the trial of Rios Montt, where they asked about the cheech that was flying over. So he said the cheech flying over metal object that was, I could consider that an airplane. But
Rusty, you're garbled again.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There we go.
So it's clear what's meant, but the interpreter just doesn't get it. Another sort of issue is that Maya conversation with multiple people speaking at the same time. So we're used to people sort of taking regular turns. I talk and you talk. But for indigenous communities in Mexico and Guatemala, it's really common for conversation to be everyone talking at once over each other. This is an example of a wedding where people are sort of praying. So when you are in conversation with Maya, you kind of have to always sort of look and see who's talking about what and where, and it can be really difficult to follow. This is from an anthropologist at Vanderbilt who transcribes discussions with the Maya at like musical scores because you have to have so many people talking at the same time. And in healthcare interactions, this sort of tendency for everyone to talk at the same time is a big detriment. So our system of healthcare is set up so that it's the doctor or nurse asks questions and the patient answers questions. Whereas for the Maya, if you went to a traditional healer, you would have multiple family members all talking at the same time. Anyone could be asking questions. Anyone could be answering questions. Rather than sort of asking what the symptoms are, they sort of are developed or come out sort of more naturally through an interaction with the caregiver. And questions tend to be open-ended. There are no sort of yes/no questions like we tend to have here. And so the sort of whole way that another feature of
Rusty, you're garbled again. Maybe make sure you're leaning forward closer to your mic.
Okay. So it's really considered bad in Maya communities to do anything that would show emotion. So you don't want people to be envious of you, so you don't show like that you're excited or proud of things. And you also don't want people to feel sympathy for you, so you don't talk about things that are traumatic. So this often leads to sort of superficial forms of agreement that are necessary to avoid disagreement and sort of maintain this public politeness. So when indigenous people tend to say yes, it's not always that they say yes, they're trying to be cooperative, but if people who sort of speak indigenous languages sort of know to ignore that first yes as simply a politeness marker, similar to someone says, how are you? And you say fine, but you're not necessarily fine, right? It's just how you answer. So it's really common for the Maya to agree with things they totally don't believe in response. So if you said, someone said, this is just a hypothetical example, I don't think it'll rain, the response would be, no, it's not going to rain, even if it's raining outside. And you would eventually sort of get up to the point where you let the person know you thought they were totally wrong. So another way of avoiding showing this emotions is to talk face to back. So so if someone is showing emotion, it's common to not look at them and turn away. So an example, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine that I've known for 20 years, and I was in the middle of a serious crisis. I was leading a study abroad program in Guatemala, and all sorts of things were going wrong. And I started to cry, and she just turned around. She kept talking, but she turned her back to me and was like, "It's going to be okay." So you really have to avoid anything that's going to sort of cause tension publicly, and that leads to lots of problems in communication. Right? So it's usually the way you demonstrate that you're paying attention, rather than saying "uh-huh" or nodding your head, is to repeat the last thing the person before you said, which also leads to miscommunication problems. So if you repeat what someone says, it's like, okay, right, you're right. But for the Maya, it just means, look, I'm listening. Deborah Tannen talks about this same problem among heterosexual married couples, where a woman says "uh-huh," meaning I'm listening, I'm hearing what you say, and the man reads "uh-huh" as yes, you are. Then finally, there are differences in how you tell stories, right? So in the Maya community, stories are often co-constructed with lots of people talking at the same time, and the thing that is sort of most important is highlighted, right? So the way that legal interactions in particular work, where a lawyer just asks questions and that may not seem relevant to the Indigenous person, and the Indigenous person typically replies with things that are sort of what they see as important. In one case, I was working with a lawyer, and he asked a woman, how old was your son? Yes. And she said, they killed my cousin. And that was, she wanted what was important and why she was afraid and why she fled to be what was told. But the way that the legal system is set up, that's difficult to do. So as an example, from the so the question is, how long did you think the war lasted? And her response was, it's good that they're listening because I had to eat roots, right? And she's talking about it was after her village was destroyed, that she had to live off plants she found in the woods, and never answers the question that they really ask. This is a really common issue, and a lot of it has to do with how I actually
You're cutting up again.
Okay. So in interactions with Indigenous people, there are different expectations for sort of how conversations should proceed, right? When you should show agreement, when you should show disagreement, how to deal with ambiguity, how to tell a story, are all different sort of ways of doing language. And they can all lead to miscommunication that results usually in just the denial of services. So a lot of sort of beliefs about language that we have end up sort of having major effects socially in a lot of different ways. And with Indigenous languages, the beliefs that we tend to have seem to reinforce and reproduce this pattern of denying language access to immigrants and refugees. So we need to support refugees and support Indigenous languages and their speakers.
All right. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? You can put your questions in the chat box. All right. Mary, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And anyone else who has heard Dr. Barrett speak before, is there anything you can add to the conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I was starting to type in the chat box, but to get out, and I see some other questions coming in, but thank you, Rusty, for that. It's jarring and shocking and important and stuff that we all need to know and keep hearing. So thank you for that. I remember last time I heard you talk that kind of on the point of, well, is it similar enough to Spanish? They've heard some Spanish all their life, you know, maybe they can get it. I think you said it's maybe chill is related to Spanish the same way that, and you had to give this great example that I don't want to steal. Can you just talk about
like it's the same as say Navajo is to English, right? So it's just a totally different language, right? Wow. From a different continent and different history.
Yeah, I think we see that in other contexts. A lot of people assume that our Congolese clients all speak French, and of course that's not. Also, yeah, I think just kind of reinforcing that is important to all of us as we see clients, that we're careful not to make those assumptions.
Yeah, it's an issue in most of the world. Yeah. There's a question about advice for people to make sure you understand. So when I work with interpreters, what I usually sort of suggest is one, to avoid yes/no questions, to try to ask things that require the person to give you information rather than confirm information, because they may just want to sort of confirm that what they think you want them to be saying. So rather than asking, you know, in a medical interaction, does your arm hurt? Say, saying something like, can you tell me if your arm hurts or doesn't hurt? Just rephrasing things in a way that doesn't suggest that you have some ulterior answer you're sort of hoping for. And the other thing that helps is to always repeat what you've just asked. So in a lot of Indigenous communities, right, as I said, people tend to not give the sort of real answer in their first response. So if you ask the question a second time, you may actually get a totally different answer.
All right, I see we have another question. Do you know if the InterpreTalk, which DCBS uses, can connect with the Mayan Language Network?
I don't know, but I don't think so. I think they only do Spanish. There are, you can get phone interpretations through the Mayan network, but I don't think they're sort of picked up by other sort of larger corporations that do interpreting services. Mm-hmm. It's often the case that they'll have someone who's not particularly well trained, who they just sort of know as a speaker of this language.
Yeah, if you don't mind to put that phone number up again, I believe it was 855.
Oh,
or maybe put it in the chat box.
MAYA USA.
Okay.
So what that is, the numbers.
Maya USA is the phone number?
Yeah, 855.
All right. Thank you.
So that's 855-629-2872.
And are there suggestions for a way to optimize the environment for interviewing Indigenous crime victims?
Yeah, I think Indigenous crime victims are going to be sort of they're likely to fear police or not know what the police are going to do. So it's just giving lots of reassurances about that they can trust these people, that they're not going to.
They're cutting out
Here,
again.
oh, sorry, but just like here, the police are known for ethnic violence, and Maya tend to be sort of fearful. So also having cross-sex interactions is probably going to cause more anxiety, particularly if a man is talking to Indigenous women.
Good to know. All right. Any other questions or any comments before we leave? I know one thing that has been asked earlier in the chat box is if you would be willing to share your PowerPoint with people.
Sure.
Okay. If you don't mind to send that to me, I can put it on our website, or I can send it to the participants as well.
Yeah, there's my email if you want to.
Thank you. And then there's a question right above that.
Yeah, so there are a few questions. So are there places in the U.S. where there are a large number of Maya people? Yes. So in Nashville has a large number of Achi Maya. Champaign, Illinois has a huge population of Katwal Maya. There's a suburb in South Florida called Indiantown, which is named after the number of Maya there. And of course in LA, there's huge numbers of all Indigenous sort of groups. In the Pacific Northwest, you tend to have people from Oaxaca, and in the Southeast, you tend to get more people from Guatemala. There was one other.
There was a question about inclusivity, but now I'm scrolling and I lost it.
Oh, cultural training, right? So no, so are refugees from Guatemala given cross-cultural training to help them be aware of differences in communication styles? No. So odds are that the parents might not understand how interactions are expected to proceed in school. So they're likely to just reply affirmatively to whatever you say about their child. Yeah.
That's something that, just to comment on Lexington in particular, those populations, the Indigenous populations that are here are typically not given refugee status before they come. So they're not being assigned to the office to take them through the orientations and classes that we have for all the refugees assigned to us. But there are people seeking asylum, and our attorneys actually just won an asylum case for an issue woman that had been denied field and find it like this week. Emily Jones, if you're on, great job. But so once people get asylum or are in that process, we are more connected with them and can provide some cultural orientation, some language classes, and support looking for jobs and other things. But if we know, the folks, then we won't obviously be able to do that. So I would we're trying to do this. We just got a new workforce grant for some asylum seekers and some other things. So I think the degree that KRM can open those classes to other people and that other people can come and find us, asylum seekers or others that aren't officially in our like official pipeline that we know about, we would be very happy to do and to support that cultural orientation and other things.
There's one more question about Northern Kentucky. There is, I don't know who that was, but wanted to know if there was a significant population of Maya in Northern Kentucky, and the answer is yes. They're mostly Mom Maya from the western part of Guatemala, and they have fairly high levels of monolingualism in Mayan languages. In particular, there's a lot of sort of capturing Mom women and forcing them into sex slavery, basically. There was a case in Lexington a few years ago. But so yeah, there are definitely a Maya community in Northern Kentucky.
Yes, Carolina had asked earlier, I believe it was Carolina, the inclusivity question. What resources can we find right now to make sure we're including these clients in getting out information about COVID-19? Yeah,
so the state COVID information website has a link to a website that just has resources on COVID in lots of different languages, minority languages, particularly indigenous languages from Latin America. So if you sort of just go to the web page where it has the Spanish and Japanese translations and so on, there should be a link that will have videos. So since most people can't read or write indigenous languages, videos are a much better way of conveying the information.
She also asked, what is your opinion about cielo? I am not familiar with that.
I'm not either.
Carolina, is that an interpreting service? Sorry, I can't find her fast enough to unmute her. Okay. All right. Anything else before we sign off of this session?
Yellow is a non-profit organization. I believe I found some information about COVID that has been translated by them. And as he said, the problem is that a lot of these people, they don't read or write. So that's the main limit that I see. I found some videos, but they're not well supported. So they cut, and some other recordings. The problem is that they don't have scripts, so I don't know what that says.
Okay.
And I'm trying to include this information in our website to share it with the community because there is a huge gap.
So the website that is on the state COVID page is from the Archive of Indigenous Languages of Latin America at the University of Texas.
So it's definitely a trusted source.
Yes.
I'm about to share the link with the group for Cielo.
Okay. Thank you, Carolina.
There you go. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all so much. We're going to go ahead and jump off of this session. We will start the next one in 15 minutes, so you have a little break in between. Thank you so much, Dr. Barrett, for taking the time to share your information and expertise with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Sure, and if you have any questions, just email me.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. See you in 15.